Hello, everyone. For our last section of Chapter 12, we're going to be looking at some things called pedigrees. A pedigree is a diagram that shows how a trait is inherited over several generations. It's sort of like a family tree that allows us to visualize how traits have been passed down from maybe like grandparents to parents to the grandchildren, for example. Reading a pedigree is not too complicated, but there's some general guidelines we want to go over. Males are going to be represented by squares on a pedigree. So if you see a square, that means it is a male. So we might refer to them as a father or a grandfather, for example. Mothers are represented by circles. So we might refer to them as mothers, grandmothers in the pedigree. An individual who exhibits a trait, for example, someone who has Huntington's disease, would be represented by a filled-in symbol. So a square that's filled in would show a male that has a certain trait. A circle that's filled in would show a female that has a certain trait. If they're not filled in, that means that whatever trait you're studying, they don't have it. Now, a horizontal line between two symbols represents a mating couple. So a lot of times we'll call them maybe dad and mom, grandma and grandpa in a pedigree. So those are some general rules to set us up for what a pedigree looks like. The offspring are going to be connected to each other by horizontal lines above the symbols. So if you have brothers and sisters, they'll be connected to each other by a horizontal line above their symbols and back to the parents by a vertical line to show that they came from those parents. So here is an example of a pedigree, and we're going to talk about some of these questions and how you can answer them. The first thing I want you to look at on this pedigree, all the way over to the left, away from all the squares and circles, you see three Roman numerals, 1, 2, and 3. That shows us that in this pedigree, there are three generations shown. So that first generation, we could maybe call them, in your family, grandma and grandpa. And then in that second generation, that would represent their kids. And then in that third generation, that would represent their grandkids. So we're going to answer a few of these questions here to see how we do. This will help you practice some questions you might be answering later on. So our first question asks us, is the mom or dad in generation 1 affected by a trait? So in order to figure this out, you go up to the very top of the pedigree where Roman numeral 1 is, and we see that we have a mom and dad over to the right of it, a square and a circle. And of those two, the square is the only one that's filled in. So that tells us that whatever trait we're looking at, the male has it. So the dad has it in this example. The mom does not. She's not filled in, so she does not have that trait. For our second question, it asks how many offspring are shown in generation 2? So for this one, the offspring of that first generation are going to be connected to each other by a horizontal line, a line that's going sideways, and connected back to the parents by a vertical line. So if you look at this, there's going to be four total offspring. I know when you're looking at that, there's 8 total individuals in generation 2, right? But only 4 of them are connected back to the parents if you follow those lines. Only 4 of them are connected back to the parents by that vertical line and to each other by that horizontal line. So if you read them across from left to right, the first child that you run into is a filled in female, so a daughter, a filled in circle. And then as you keep on moving from left to right, you have a male who was not filled in. And then as you keep on moving over, you have a filled in square that represents a male. And then as you keep moving over to find the next offspring, you have a circle that is filled in. Now, the individuals who are not connected back to the parents, those represent the mates for the children. So, for example, in generation 2, there is a unfilled in square with that circle. That means that that daughter has mated with and formed a mating pair with that male that is represented by that square. So basically, in generation 2, what this is showing you is 4 brothers and sisters, and then their husbands and wives, we could say. Now, uh, how many sons and daughters are in generation 2? So for generation 2, there are 4 offspring, and 2 of them are female. So there's 2 daughters, and then there are 2 sons. How many have the trait? So in generation 2, of the 4 offspring, 2 of them, I'm sorry, 3 of them have the trait. So 3 of the offspring are filled in. We have 2 daughters that have the trait, and we have a son that has the trait, that filled in square. So 3 out of the 4 have that trait. And then for one of our last questions here, how many offspring does daughter 1 have? So for generation 2, we're going to be looking at daughter number 1. So in that case, we would look over to the left of that generation, a second generation, and we see we have a filled in daughter. She actually has a number 2 underneath it, so that might be a little confusing. But for that daughter, in that one, she has 3 offspring, right? Underneath her, we have in generation 3, 1, 2, 3 offspring that are connected back to that daughter. And then how many have the trait? 2 of them. The 2 offspring out of 3 have the trait. The circle is filled in, and the square is filled in. So she has a daughter and a son that have that trait. So that's how you read these. You look at what generation the question's asking you about, and you figure out, okay, which of these are the offspring, which are male, which are female. Those are some basic questions which you'll need to be able to answer about those. So dominant traits are going to be passed on to a son or daughter even if only one parent has it. Remember, dominant traits are represented by a capital letter. So having just one capital letter gives you that dominant trait. So let's say that we have a mom and a dad and only the dad has this dominant trait. The mother has the recessive trait. The children will still get that dominant trait. And they'll get that capital letter and they'll have that trait. So dominant traits, they show up a lot because they'll be passed down even if only one parent has it. Every affected individual of this dominant trait is going to have at least one affected parent because that's where they got it. Affected individuals who mate with unaffected individuals will have a 50% chance of transmitting the trait to each child. So if someone is dominant for a trait and they're mating with someone who is recessive, when they pass those traits down, there's at least a 50% chance that the kids will get that dominant trait. It is also possible for 2 affected parents to have unaffected children. If we look at this pedigree in generation 2, we can see that individuals 1 and 2, we have a male and a female who are shaded in. So that would be, a mother and a father who are having children. They are both they both have the dominant trait because they're both shaded in. So when we look at their children, it looks like 2 of the children have that trait as well, but one of them in generation 3, that circle is not filled in. So they have a daughter who does not have that dominant trait. How could that happen? Well, in this case, what probably happened is that the father has maybe a capital A and a lowercase a, and the mother has a capital A and a lowercase a. We're just using A's for the sake of this question. So they're heterozygous. So that means that there is a possibility, a 25% chance that one of their kids could get a lowercase a from dad and a lowercase a from mom. So if they got those two lowercase a's, then they won't have that trait because they wouldn't have any capital letters. So they have a much higher chance of having children who have the trait. That's why 2 out of the 3 are filled in, but they also have a 25% chance of having a child that does not. So just because two parents have a dominant trait, that does not mean that they're always going to have children who always have the trait. Now, recessive traits behave a little bit differently than dominant traits. Recessive traits are passed on to children from both parents, although parents may seem perfectly normal. So, both parents could be carriers for a recessive trait, and they pass down those carried recessive traits to their children, and they could get a trait that wasn't necessarily showing up in the parents. So characteristics of recessive pedigrees are as follows. An individual who is affected may have parents who are not affected. All the children of two affected parents are going to be affected. They're going to have the trait if their parents show that trait. In pedigrees involving rare traits, the unaffected parents of an affected individual may be related to each other. So there are some rare traits, especially when we look back at like ancient, like England and stuff like that, when like closer relatives used to have children to pass down, a royal bloodline. There are some rare traits that have been passed down there as well. So those are some things that we'll be talking about as we look at these recessive pedigrees. So this is an example of a recessive pedigree. One of the clues to know that you're looking at a recessive pedigree is that many of the shapes will not be shaded in. There should only be a couple that are shaded in because recessive traits show up much less commonly because you have to have two lowercase letters to get them. For the dominant trait, you only have to have one capital letter to get it. So in this pedigree here, where did the trait seen in generation 3 come from? So if we look down at generation 3, this is where we first start to see some of the filled in shapes. We see some two squares, so two males that are shaded in, they have the recessive trait, and we see a female that has the recessive trait. So where did this trait come from? Well, it was passed down from the parents. The parents were likely carriers for this recessive trait. Even though the parents are not shaded in, they were likely carrying one lowercase letter each. So they had the dominant trait because they only had one lowercase letter. They had a capital letter along with it, but they still passed those lowercase letters down. And some of the offspring got a pair of two lowercase letters. If they got two lowercase letters, they have the trait. Okay, you have to have two of those lowercase letters or two of those lowercase alleles to have that recessive trait. So that's what we're seeing here. The parents are passing them down even though you don't see them shaded in. So let's practice answering some questions about recessive traits. For this pedigree, let's look at our first question. If individuals 2 and 3 in generation 3 have more children, will they be affected? So let's look at generation 3 on our third line down. We have individual 2 and 3. We have a square that's shaded in and a circle that is shaded in. So we have a male and a female that have already had two kids. Look down at the bottom for generation 4. Both of their kids already have it. So we're asking if they have more kids, will they be affected? This answer is yes. Both the male and female have the recessive trait. That means they have to have two lowercase letters for each of them. So they can only pass down lowercase letters. So the children are only going to get those lowercase recessive alleles. So every child will have the recessive trait. For our next question, can individual number 8 in generation 3 have any unaffected children? So for individual number 8 in generation 3, we have a male that is shaded in, so he has the recessive trait. And if he mates with someone, we're asking if he could have children that will not have that recessive trait. The answer to that is yes, he could have unaffected children. If he mates with someone who is carrying just one lowercase letter and then one capital letter, then there's a chance that his kids would get that capital letter, and that would dominate over the recessive ones, and they would not be affected. So there's a couple situations in which that male could have children where they're not affected. He could mate with someone who has all capital letters, and then none of his children would be affected. So that's going to be one of the reasons why recessive traits are going to be showing up less commonly in pedigrees. And then lastly, for individual number 9, is it possible for individual number 9 in generation 3 to have affected children? This is a tough question to answer because in these pedigrees, we don't have ones that are half shaded in. If you saw one that was half shaded in, let's see if I can show that to you here. So if we had like individual number 9, I'm shading in half of it now. Great artwork. If they look like that, then they would be carriers for the trait, and it would be possible for them to have affected kids. So if they are a carrier like that, then yes, they could have affected children. If they are not filled in at all, okay, if they were just like that, then they would not have the possibility of having affected kids. So since these pedigrees don't seem to be showing half shaded in ones like that, we're going to assume that he could either be a carrier or could have 2 dominant traits. So for our last question there, it's possible that he could have affected children because he could be passing down one of those lowercase letters if he was a carrier and giving that to the children, along with if they mate with someone who has 2 lowercase letters. So yes, it is possible that he could have affected children for this recessive trait. So cystic fibrosis is an example of a recessive trait that is passed down, and we can look at with pedigrees. Cystic fibrosis, unfortunately, is usually very deadly to children and individuals who receive that gene. A lot of children won't make it past maybe their teenage years. Adults who do make it past their teenage years, a lot of them live to maybe 40 or so. It's a maximum. It's just a really horrible disease that affects the lungs. It causes fluid and mucus to build up. It causes lots of issues with breathing. So a lot of times they might have to get lung transplants and things like that in order to survive this condition. So this is passed down by a recessive trait. So we're lucky that that's the case, because if it was passed down by dominant traits, then a lot more people would have this condition. So let's take a look at our pedigree over to the right. We have a male and a female. Instead of using a square and a circle, they're using a male body and a female body. That's another way that this could be done, but you usually see it with squares and circles. But in this case, we have a male who is half shaded in orange, so he's a carrier for the recessive trait of cystic fibrosis. He does not have it, but he's carrying the trait. So there's a chance that he could pass it down to his children. He's mating with a female that does not have the trait at all, so she's not a carrier for it at all. So that's good in this situation because they're not going to have any kids who have cystic fibrosis, because each of their kids is going to receive at least one capital letter for this trait from their mom. And we can see that some of the kids, half of them, 50% chance that the kids will receive one lowercase letter from dad. So even though these parents will not have any kids with cystic fibrosis, some of their kids could be carriers for this, and they could pass it down to their children. So they're not going to have it because they're carriers, but they could pass it down and give it to their kids. We're going to finish up by talking about some examples of other genes and traits that maybe don't follow the dominant and recessive pattern so much. And this is referred to as polygenic inheritance. This is where traits are going to be influenced by several genes, not just one gene. And actually, most human characteristics tend to be polygenic. For example, skin color is going to be related to about 6 different genes, the traits that you get from those genes. Eye color is another example. Height and hair color, those are different types of traits that actually are going to be affected by more than one type of gene. Many traits are also complex characters. This means that these are traits influenced by both genes and the environment. For example, your skin color, your skin tone. You have a lot of genes that go into that to give you your skin tone, but also the amount of sunlight you get, that has an effect on the melanin in your skin, and can make your skin lighter and darker over time. Height is another example. You might have the genes, for example, to be 6 feet tall, but the nutrition that you eat also plays a role in that. So even though you have the genetic capability of being 6 feet tall, if you don't have good nutrition when you're growing up, you might not reach that height. Okay, so good nutrition is something from the environment that also plays a role in height. Other types of diseases like breast cancer, lots of different types of cancers, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, even mental conditions like schizophrenia. All of those, not only are there genes that help make those more likely, but things in the environment can trigger those as well. With cancers, different types of drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, those can make those more likely. For heart disease, diabetes, having poor diets can make those more likely. Different events that happen in your life can help lead and trigger different mental conditions to show up as well. So the environment does play a role in a lot of genes and a lot of traits. It's not just what you get in your DNA. Some genes are controlled by 3 or more alleles. These are called multiple allele genes. An example that we have talked about is human blood type. There's the allele I capital A, that's for blood type A. The allele I with a capital B, that is the allele for blood type B. And then we have the lowercase I allele, that is for type O blood. So there are 3 alleles for blood types, both the I with a capital A and the I with a capital B, both that's for A and B blood types, those are going to be dominant over the lowercase I, which is for O. This codes for sugars that are on the blood cell surface. We talked about that earlier on. There are 4 main blood types, A, B, and O. O is recessive to everything in this case. So here's a chart that we looked at earlier this year just to remind you of what those different blood types look like. So for our first question here, what are the 2 genotypes for type B blood? So for type B blood, you could either have capital B, so an I with a capital B and an I with a capital B, or you could just have a B and an O. So an I with a capital B above it and then a lowercase I with nothing above it. Those are your 2 possible genotypes for type B blood. Which blood types can donate to all others? We said that that type is type O because type O does not have any of those antigens on its red blood cell. There's no A's on it, there's no B's on it. So if that's given to anybody, the blood cells are not going to be attacked by that other person's body because they won't recognize it as a foreign substance. So that is going to be something that could be given to everyone. So type O blood, it can be donated to anybody. X-linked traits are something we mentioned a little bit about before. These are traits that are found only on the X chromosome. That's one of our sex chromosomes. Since males only have one X chromosome, they are going to be affected more than females. Females have two X chromosomes. Males just have one X chromosome and the Y chromosome. So females have 2 chances to get a good copy of an X-linked gene, but males only get 1 chance. Whatever they have on their X chromosome, that is the trait that they're going to have. There's no chance for it to be balanced out by another X chromosome. Here are some examples of X-linked traits. Hemophilia, this is a blood clotting disorder where platelets don't form properly, the blood's very thin, and if you get a cut or something like that, you can bleed to death. So it shows up more in males because it's an X-linked trait. Another X-linked trait is muscular dystrophy. This affects the cardiac, the heart muscle, and the skeletal muscle, as well as some mental functions. So this causes the breakdown of those muscles, uh, problems with movement, problems with thinking sometimes. So that's another X-linked trait. Fragile X syndrome is going to be where part of the X chromosome has errors. It looks like it's going to break off. It looks very fragile. This is the most common cause of different types of mental delays in males. And then red-green color blindness. This is going to be something that shows up more in males because it's X-linked. Males cannot see these two colors if they have this type of color blindness. So mostly males have red-green color blindness. Not too big of an impact on people's lives, but it makes the colors red and green appear kind of weird. Different shades of gray to those individuals. So that's something that shows up more in males. There are also types of traits called sex influence traits. And this is where males and females show different phenotypes, even though they have the same genotype. So they have a different physical appearance in males and females, even though they have the same gene for it. One of the most common ones is the allele for pattern baldness. So the allele in males that causes pattern baldness is dominant, but it is recessive in females. So that's why male pattern baldness, balding is usually found in men. Now it could show up in females too, but if look around at most men who are older, in their 50s and 60s, a lot of them have lost at least some of their hair. Now, some males won't have much thinning of their hair at all until they get very, very old. But male pattern baldness is common. It shows up in probably over 70% of males. I know even my hair is starting to thin out a little bit in some places. So that's something that shows up more commonly in males than in females. That's a sex influence trait. The hormones that males and females have play a role in this trait. So the hormone that males have more of, testosterone, that causes this trait to lead to baldness in males. In females, it usually doesn't. They have to have the recessive letters for this trait. There are also some traits that are controlled by a single allele, a single letter. So individuals only get one letter for a trait. And it can be dominant or recessive. Some dominant examples include dwarfism, so individuals having a dwarf size. This is something that is, these conditions are going to be a little bit more rare, but they do show up enough in our population that it's important to talk about some of these conditions. Polydactyly is the presence of a sixth digit, usually on the feet, like having an extra toe. Huntington's disease, sometimes called Woody-Guthrie's disease. This is a progressive destruction of the brain cells that can happen after age 30. That's an example of a single allele trait. And then Marfan syndrome. This is a progressive connective tissue disorder. So over time, people's connective tissue start to break down. And in some cases of this can actually be new mutations with no family history. Some single allele recessive traits include albinism, so being albino, lacking pigmentation in the skin, hair, and the eyes. Homozygous recessive people make no pigments, so they don't have any melanin, so they, their skin tone's very, very light, very, very fair. Another one is PKU. This is short for phenylketonuria, and these individuals lack an enzyme to use the amino acid phenylalanine. This is an amino acid that we eat in our diet. Sometimes our body also makes it. It's in a lot of diet sodas, phenylalanine's in there. People who have PKU, they can't break it down. And this can build up, and this can lead to brain damage and lead to different types of mental delays in individuals who have this. And about 1 in 15,000 infants have this. It can be treated with diet. The easiest way to go about this is by making sure that they don't eat or consume any phenylalanine. Another single allele recessive trait is Tay-Sachs disease. This is the degeneration of the nervous system over time. Children who have this rarely survive past 5 years of age. Sickle cell anemia is another example that we've talked about a little bit. This is where a single amino acid substitution in hemoglobin causes lack of oxygen to the body. So it changes the shape of the red blood cells and prevents them from passing on enough oxygen throughout the body. Cystic fibrosis, we talked about this one a little bit. This creates a sticky, thick mucus inside the lungs. One way to test for this is by doing a sweat test. We can look for chloride ions in a person's sweat to see if they have this condition. This was once considered a fatal childhood disease. Uh, a lot of children still might not make it past their childhood, but modern treatments can increase the lifespan to over 30 years. There are a few ways today to detect genetic diseases in babies. One way is by amniocentesis. So the doctor will go in to the where the baby is and remove some of the amniotic fluid during the 14th to 18th week of pregnancy. They'll analyze that fluid around the baby to look for proteins and maybe look at some chromosomes, and this might give us some information about if this baby has a certain type of disease or a trait. There is a small risk to the pregnancy by doing this, but it is very small. Chorionic villi sampling is another way that we can test for things. We can actually clip cells from the placental area up towards where the umbilical cord is attached to the mom, and we can look at some of those cells and look at those chromosomes and see if there's anything that we can find there. Treatments vary with disease. Some diseases can be treated with medicine, some diseases can be treated with different types of therapy, and then some diseases, there's just really no way to cure them, but maybe you can try to make them a little bit less harmful and deadly for the individual who has it. There's a new therapies coming out called gene therapies. This is a technique that places a healthy copy of a gene into the cells of a person whose copy of the gene is defective. Also, one term I want you to know is genetic counseling. This is the process of informing a person or a couple about their genetic makeup and how their offspring may be affected. So if two individuals know that some type of trait or disease runs in their family, they might go see a genetic counselor to see what the chances are that they would pass this on to their kids if they chose to have some. Many people go see genetic counselors today because they want to know, okay, if we have a kid, is there a chance they could have some type of really, really bad disease, disabling condition? So that's a growing field some of you guys might be interested in later on if you're interested in genetics and helping couples decide if they want to have kids and helping them figure out what the chances are that their kids could get a certain type of condition.